To admit, yesterday was not a good football day for me. Every single team that I rooted for lost. Some by very close margins, others by significant margins. It was a devastating day, and I'm hoping for better this morning. But I will say that, as we come together for worship, it kind of reminds me of the priorities that we have and how insignificant that is, and it kind of helps me move beyond that. So I think that's always great to come here and just praise God. Life is filled with choices. And they have this phrase in business terms. They talk about cost-benefit analysis. And I think we do a lot of cost-benefit analysis throughout our lives. Every day we're making choices. So, you're going through the grocery store and you see that donut. And you maybe haven't had a donut for a long time. And it just starts, catches your eye. And you think, okay, is that really worth the 50 zillion calories and extra 20 pounds that it'll cost me to have that? And so you say, no, maybe not. Or maybe you say, yeah, it's worth it because I haven't had one for a long time. Or you're shopping in the mall and you see those shoes and you think, is that really worth $200 for that pair of shoes? And for me, of course, the answer would be no, not at all. But for others, maybe yeah, that's worth $200. Or I've done this before where I've left the grocery store and I get back home and then I realize there's that one item that I left, and I forgot to get. And so is it worth the 20 minutes to go back to the store and come back home and the gas it will take to get that bottle of ketchup? Well, it depends on what we're having for dinner that night. If you need ketchup, you need ketchup. And so you're going to go back and do it. Otherwise, you say, I'll do it next time. And so those are just kind of some of the mundane choices that we make and cost-benefit analysis we make. There's others that are more significant. I have some students this weekend that are doing some cost-benefit analysis. They got a test on Wednesday. And so some of them are trying to decide, is it really worth all the time it's going to take me to study to get that A? Or maybe I'll just have a little bit more fun this weekend and get that B, or maybe at worst get a C. Not realizing, of course, that they'll probably get a D. But, that's just all part of the cost-benefit analysis. And we do that with relationships as well, where we have to decide, is it worth the time and the energy and the emotional commitment to go from acquaintance to friend, or even something more significant. So I remember when my wife and I first met, we were in a singles group at church. And we'd been introduced by somebody there, and she actually was the one who asked me out first. And we went to a Memphis State basketball game, and because her dad had season tickets for that. So we went to the game, and then later, after the game, we were looking around for some place to eat, couldn't find any place, so she invited me back to her parents' house, and she sat there and fixed, dinner. I thought, this is pretty cool. And that was great. But I was in graduate school at the time, and I remember very distinctly thinking after that evening, as I was walking back to the dorm, I thought, this will never go anywhere because I just have too much studying to do. And, it wasn't worth it to me at that moment. Well, the next day it became worth it to me. But, at that moment I was thinking, no, this isn't going to be worth it. So I changed my assessment as I went along. But we also do, a cost-benefit analysis with regard to our faith. After all, if there's nothing that we're going to derive from following God and worshiping God and praising God, then why would we do it? That there has to be some kind of benefit. And I don't mean that it's just always material rewards. It's the perceived benefit of those who follow God. So for some, it's the idea that, maybe there's eternal life at the end. For others, there's this sense in which there's purpose in my life here and now if I follow God. Or maybe there's comfort in difficult circumstances. And so we have to do this kind of analysis. We have to decide, is it worth it? Now, if your faith doesn't cost you very much, then it might not be a difficult question. But what if your faith costs you everything? Then it's a serious question. And so you might remember that last week we read about a key turning point in Jesus' ministry back in chapter 8. His disciples finally came to understand that Jesus was Messiah, and they confessed that. And their picture of this powerful, mighty, victorious Messiah lasts for about 10 seconds until Jesus begins to tell them, that's not who I'm going to be. And so he changes their picture and replaces it with a beaten and scourged and crucified Messiah. And also adds that, by the way, if you want to be one of my followers, you have to take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. And so now it becomes a real question. Look at verse 35 of chapter 8. I think we've got that yet. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. Now think about it. If you signed on as a follower of Jesus because you imagined that he was going to lead you as the Jewish Messiah against the Romans, and that there would be glory and victory, and you're having pictures of yourself high up in the administration, maybe even like vice president or something, one of the cabinet members, then when all that gets shattered, and he tells you that's not going to happen, then the statement that you have to lose your life if you want to save it, that's not very attractive. And that's where the story for this week comes in. Look at chapter 9, beginning in verse 2. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, this is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Mark adds, of course, in parentheses, he didn't know what he was saying because they were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. Now, we know from other stories in the gospel that Peter, James, and John are part of the inner core of Jesus' disciples, and they're privileged to have this kind of awesome experience where Jesus becomes radiantly bright, dazzling before them. And 2 of the most prominent figures from the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, appear at talking with Jesus. Now, Mark doesn't tell us anything about what they were saying. He does give us Peter's ramblings about building these booths. And many have suggested that Peter, of course, he always has to speak up and say something stupid. But then he's trying to capture the moment. He's like, okay, we need some booths here because we're going to be here a while. Not realizing that this is only kind of a temporary event. But the story raises lots of questions. First of which is, how do the disciples know that it's Moses and Elijah? And my answer has always been, because they wore name tags. And so they were very clear with name tags. There was probably names being mentioned in the conversation. That's how they know. But why Moses and Elijah? Why not Abraham and David? Why not Isaiah and Jeremiah? Why these 2? And some have suggested it's because Moses represents the law and Elijah represents the prophet, and so the prophets and the law are supporting Jesus, perhaps. I don't know. I don't think that's a very good answer. But I think there's something more going on here. For starters, we need to remember some things about the stories of these 2 figures. So let's go back and look at Deuteronomy 18:15. Do you remember what Moses himself had said? Verse 15. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your own people. You must listen to him." And Jesus, very clearly in Luke's gospel, is identified as the prophet like Moses. So the Jews were expecting somebody, an authoritative figure like Moses, to eventually come. And Jesus fills that role. And then what about Elijah? Well, Elijah was expected by the Jews to come before the day of the Lord. Now, of course, they thought of the day of the Lord in some completely different terms. But Jesus, when he talks about the kingdom, it also recognizes that Elijah is going to come before that day. And so some have suggested that's why Moses and Elijah are. Moses is Jesus' predecessor, and Elijah is the precursor. He's the one that signals that the kingdom is coming. But I think something even more interesting is going on here. Because both Moses and Elijah have experiences, very powerful experiences of God that are similar to, in some ways, what we see here on the Mount Transfiguration. So you might remember, of course, that Moses went up and got the 10 Commandments. Do you remember what he looked like when he came back down? So look at Exodus 34. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of the covenant of the law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. So evidently there's something about being in the presence of God that makes one shining and dazzling and radiant and so forth. But there's something else that maybe you don't remember about this as much that happens earlier in the story, before he ever goes and gets the law. And this is immediately after the story of the golden calf. Remember that the Israelites disobeyed God, or I guess you could say that they went against God in making an idol. And God wasn't very happy with them. And so God basically tells Moses, you leave Sinai, you go take the land, I'll just, I'm going to stay here. And Moses is like, well, I'm not really wanting to go anywhere if you don't go with us. I kind of need you along. And so he doesn't want to go until God promises that his presence will go with them. And then he asks for a special favor. Look at verse 18 of Exodus 33. Then Moses said, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Then the Lord said, there is a place near me where you stand in the rock, and when my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will move my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. And so Moses is given this extraordinary experience of God. And I think the reason for that is because they're about to face some difficult times. And Moses is afraid. And Moses isn't sure that God is going to be with them. And God says, I will give you a glimpse of my glory. And that will sustain you. Because he's feeling vulnerable. And he needs God's presence. And you might remember that Elijah also has a similar experience. You remember his famous encounter with the prophets of Baal. And he seems so strong and powerful in that one, right? He's calling out the prophets of Baal and he's saying, you guys call on your God and I'll call on my God. And we'll see which one lights this altar on fire. And of course the prophets of Baal, they can't do very much. And then God consumes the altar with fire. And then, if you remember how that story ends, Elijah ends up slaughtering all the prophets of Baal. Very, very powerful figure. But then Jezebel, King Ahab's wife, puts out a kill order on Elijah, and he gets kind of scared. And he runs away. And he hides in the wilderness. And he thinks, God, just let me die. Life's no good anymore. But God comes and he sends an angel and he provides for him. He gives him food, he gives him water. And Elijah's feeling very sorry for himself. He's feeling a bit anxious and he's feeling somewhat despondent. And so God gives him this amazing gift. Look at 1 Kings 19. He went into a cave to spend the night, and the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, well, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face. And he went out and he stood at the mouth of the cave. Then the voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant and torn down your altars and put your prophets to death with the sword. And I'm the only one left. Now they're trying to kill me too. And the Lord said, go back the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus, and when you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Both of these events, by the way, happen on exactly the same mountain. This is Mount Horeb. It's exactly the same mountain where God reveals himself to these key characters. And I think they have something in common here because both of them were facing a sense of discouragement and disillusionment. And God in both cases gives them a glimpse of his glory to encourage them and to sustain them and to help them move forward. He appears to them so that they will know that the road ahead is worth taking. And I think that helps us understand what's going on here in the story of the Transfiguration. You see, the disciples have been told that Jesus is going to suffer and die. Now, they don't really understand it yet. They won't understand it until later. But they're going to find themselves called to a very high price. And there's a time when they'll need what they're going to get on this mountain. But here on this mountain, this Jesus who will be ignominiously suffer and die for their sins, he is revealed to them in all his glory. And I think it's meant to reinforce their faith. Look at the voice. Notice the voice. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. It's a similar voice to what we saw at the baptism of Jesus. But at the baptism, the voice was for Jesus. Remember, you are my son. This voice is for the disciples. It's for them to know that this Jesus that they follow is worth following. God himself shows up in the form of a cloud, just like in the Old Testament. And he reveals himself and confirms Jesus as his son. Yet mountaintop experiences can never last for long, and so they have to descend, and on the way down their ignorance is revealed. Jesus says, well, don't tell anybody about this until the Son of Man rises from the dead. And they're looking at each other saying, what does he mean by rising from the dead? I don't know what he's talking about. Right? They still don't get it. It's not until later that they're going to get all this and understand it. But it's an experience that's very important and powerful for them, especially later on. But what do we do with this? It's an intriguing story, but how does it help us? After all, we didn't witness the Transfiguration. We didn't see Jesus in all his glory. Have you ever tried to imagine being one of those guys? Have you ever thought, well, what if I was Moses or Elijah or Peter and I'd experienced that? Wouldn't that be great? And then you say, well, if I'd experienced that, I would never doubt again. I wouldn't be like them. I'd be faithful. Just give me one glimpse of your glory, God, and then I'd be good for the rest of my life. I wouldn't be like these unfaithful ones. But I think most Christians are like that. We all have our moments of doubt, just like Moses and Elijah did. They experienced great revelations, but they also suffered doubt. You see, life as Christians, it would be nice, but we can't live on the mountaintop. We live down in the trenches. We live where life is very gritty and it's filled with evil and it's filled with apathy. We're surrounded by people who don't recognize God as God. And they say they ignore God or they scorn God and they scorn those who follow God. And sometimes the very ordinariness of life can suck us in and cause us to forget why we're even disciples. And I think that's precisely why we need mountaintop experiences. We need times when God's presence is real and undeniable. And I believe that God gives us those throughout our lives. That He does give us glimpses of glory. Times when His presence is palpable and real and we know, at least for a moment, sometimes a very short moment, that He's there. You know, oftentimes I think nature is like that. Nature, creation itself can do that for us. So if you ever stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon and you look out and you say, wow, there's God. Now I went to school at the University of Arizona in Tucson. One of the games last night that didn't go so well. In fact, it went horribly wrong. But, I remember being a freshman and a sophomore and 18, 19 years old, and life was fun but overwhelming at times. You try and figure out what you're going to do with your life, and there were struggles. And so I would ride my motorcycle out to the hills surrounding Tucson at night, And if you stand on the hills surrounding Tucson, you look one way, you see the city lights, and if you look the other way, you're going to see a sky filled with stars. And you hear the coyotes howling. And you feel really small. And you recognize that the problems that you face are minuscule. And that God is far beyond us. And you get a glimpse of glory. And it would strengthen me. And it would give me the what I needed to kind of get through whatever the troubles were that I was facing. I think nature often does that for us. It gives us glimpses of glory, and it reminds us of our God. But I think people also do that. You know, it's very discouraging sometimes when you're watching the news or you're reading the newspaper and you hear all of these horrible stories and you think, why is there so much evil in the world? And you just think people are horrible. It's like, where's God in all this? And you begin to lose hope. And then I'll hear a story about somebody. Somebody who sacrifices of himself with no hope of personal gain, or a story of radical transformation. I say, there's God. I see Him. And I get a glimpse of glory. And I get encouraged again. I remember a story not long ago of a guy who took up feeding of the homeless, and he started really small, and then he got his whole family involved, and every afternoon he cooks for like 100 homeless folks, and he cooks soup or stew or something, and spends several hours cooking the meal, and then he goes out and he serves it to the homeless. There's a glimpse of glory. You know, when I was in graduate school, I thought I wanted to be a missionary. In fact, I spent a lot of years preparing to be a missionary. I wanted to go to the jungle, and I wanted to teach those who were kind of had never heard about the gospel, to go kind of deep into the primitive tribal groups. And I came across this story, and some of you I think are probably very familiar with this very famous story from long ago. And it's the story of Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot was a missionary who wanted to go to Ecuador. And he was going to go to the Auca Indian tribe in Ecuador. And this was a tribe that was famously known for its violence. Anybody who encroached on their territory was often attacked. And so Jim Elliot spent a number of years preparing himself in seminary and in preacher training and all kind of stuff, getting himself ready. And then he and his friends moved down to Ecuador, and he spent another year learning Spanish, and then he spent another year learning the local tribal culture, and he and his friends decided on a strategy to try and reach out to this people that know Jesus, that needed to know Jesus. And so they would fly over in an airplane, and they had this bucket, and they would lower the bucket down with gifts in it. And they did that, and they had a speaker system where they could use the little phrases that they knew to try and indicate to the people that they were friends and that they were friendly. And they did that for a period of time. And then after a while, the tribe actually sent back in the bucket a gift for them. And they thought, oh, this is good. This is great. And so the 5 of them landed on a sandy beach strip by the river. And they were greeted by 3 of the Auca tribe, and everything seemed to be going well, and they were very excited. But a few days later, the tribe showed up with spears. Later that evening, their wives back in the village there, the town that they were living in, were waiting by the radio for the report of the local activities, what had happened that day. But no report came. They sent out a search party, and they found their bodies there by the river, stabbed through with spears. And it's in that part of the story that you begin to wonder, why would God let this happen? I mean, after all, here are men that had committed themselves. I mean, beyond what most Christians would do, they committed themselves to go to this very difficult place, to this very difficult people, and they said, God, just use us as your instruments. And there they are, strewn across the sandy beach. And you wonder, where's God? Jim Elliot has a famous quote in his diary. It says, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. I can't help but think that that's based on Mark 8:35 and an understanding of what Jesus called his disciples to do and be. You know, it's a tragic story, but it doesn't end there, because the missionary wives, they didn't run away. They continued the work of their husbands, and they actually were able to get into that tribe. In fact, Jim's wife, Elizabeth, and their very young daughter ended up living among that tribe for 2 years. And several from that tribe became Christians. And in fact, one of the guys that was killed, the airplane pilot, his son, and one of the guys that killed his father became friends. And that man, Minkaya, and that boy, Steve, have traveled together and done evangelistic lectures together, preaching the gospel and sharing the faith. Because they didn't give up. And it's in those moments of not only radical sacrifice on the part of those missionaries, but also the unbelievable transformation among those tribal people, that I see glimpses of glory. I see God's hand at work, and I think, there he is. I can see him. And he gives me courage, and he gives me the power I need to move on. Let's have the praise team come up as we finish. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts as we think about the story of the Transfiguration and what it means for us. One is, I want to encourage us to look around us for the way God reveals us in each of our lives. That there are these moments, these very powerful moments that can sustain us. If we keep our eyes open, if we look for them, we can have those glimpses of glory. Don't close your eyes, but see them for what they are. And then lastly, I want us to recognize that sometimes we might be that glimpse of glory for somebody else. That in our faithfulness in walking with God, in something that we might do or something that we might say, people might look at us and say, there it is, I see him, I see God. And we can encourage them, and we can transform them. Let's continue to praise God.